The train slowed with a long, tired groan as it rolled across the empty stretch of prairie. Dust lifted from the tracks and drifted through the dry air like smoke from a dying fire. Out here the land felt endless and unforgiving, the kind of place where a man either made something of himself or watched everything he owned turn to dust. Standing near the small wooden platform, a lone cowboy waited with his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the train as if his whole future rode inside one of those cars. His ranch sat a few miles beyond the horizon, though calling it a ranch these days felt generous. The grass had thinned to brittle patches, the cattle were fewer each month. Wells that once gave steady water now coughed up only mud and silence. Folks in town said the land had turned against him. Others said a man should know when to walk away. But walking away had never been in his nature. So he tried something desperate, a letter sent months ago. A promise written on thin paper and carried across states by rail and horse. A request for a mail-order bride? Most men in town had laughed when they heard about it. They said bringing a woman to a failing ranch was like tying a wagon to a sinking boat. Still, the cowboy had his reasons. He needed help, needed hope, maybe even someone stubborn enough to stand beside him while the land decided whether to give life or take it. The train finally stopped with a sharp hiss of steam. Passengers stepped down one by one, travelers with carpetbags, traders with crates, a tired family chasing a new start somewhere farther west. The cowboy watched each face carefully. For a moment he wondered if the whole idea had been foolish. Maybe she never came. Maybe the letter had been ignored. Then he saw her. She stepped down from the train car carefully, gripping a worn leather suitcase. Her dress was simple but sturdy, the kind made for work rather than show. Dust from the journey clung to the hem, and a few loose strands of hair had escaped from the knot behind her head. She paused at the top step and studied the quiet station, her eyes sharp and thoughtful like someone already measuring the world around her. The cowboy straightened a little. She did not look frightened. That surprised him. Most people felt uneasy the first time they saw how empty this land was. But this woman looked across the prairie as if she had seen harder places before. Their eyes met. He stepped forward slowly, boots pressing into the dirt, unsure what kind of greeting fit a marriage arranged by letters and faith alone. Up close, he noticed the firmness in her posture and the calm way she held herself. There was something steady about her, something that did not quite match the story she had written about being a quiet woman looking for a simple life. "You came a long way," he said. Her gaze moved past him toward the distant plains, toward the direction of the ranch she had agreed to share with the stranger. "I did," she replied. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind slid across the tracks and rattled the loose boards of the platform. Somewhere far off a crow called. Finally she lifted her suitcase again and stepped down onto the dirt. "I suppose we should get going," she said. The cowboy nodded and turned toward the wagon waiting nearby. As they walked, he began explaining the ranch, the dry wells, the failing cattle, the way the land had been slipping away from him one stubborn season at a time. He expected worry, maybe regret. Instead, she listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she looked out across the wide sunburned prairie once more. Then she said something that made him stop walking altogether. "Before we reach the ranch," she said calmly, "there is something you should know." She tightened her grip on the suitcase. "I did not come here only to be a bride." The cowboy slowed his steps and looked at her. The wagon stood a few yards ahead, its wooden frame creaking softly in the wind. Out here, the land was quiet enough that a man could hear his own thoughts, and right now his thoughts were running faster than the train that had just left the station. He studied the woman beside him again. She did not look nervous about what she had just said. If anything, she looked like someone who had already decided how the rest of the conversation would go. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. She shifted the suitcase in her hand and glanced toward the wide prairie. The wind moved through the dry grass like waves across a faded sea. "I meant exactly what I said," she replied calmly. "I agreed to the marriage. That part is true. But the letters I sent you did not tell the whole story." The cowboy folded his arms and leaned lightly against the wagon wheel. "I figured as much," he said. "Most folks keep a few things to themselves when writing letters to strangers." A faint smile touched her face, though it did not last long. This is a little different. For a moment she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. The cowboy waited. Life on the frontier had taught him patience. Sometimes the truth took its time walking out into the open. I grew up on land not so different from yours, she said at last. Dry summers, long winters, crops that only survived when someone worked twice as hard as the soil deserved. He nodded slowly. Sounds familiar? My father believed land could always be saved if a person understood it well enough, she continued. Most people thought he was stubborn. Some said he was foolish. The cowboy gave a quiet chuckle. People say that about me too. She looked at him then, studying him with those steady eyes. Maybe they say it because stubborn men sometimes refuse to see when something deeper is wrong? The words hung in the air for a moment. The cowboy straightened and pushed his hat back slightly. You saying my ranch is worse than I think? I'm saying dying land usually has a reason. That made him pause. For the past 2 years he had blamed the weather, the dry winds, the shrinking water supply. Those were problems every rancher out here understood. But the way she spoke made it sound like she believed something else might be hiding beneath the surface. That secret skill you mentioned, he said slowly. It has something to do with land? She nodded once. Yes. The cowboy waited for her to explain further, but she remained quiet. Instead, she walked to the wagon and placed her suitcase inside. The leather case landed with a dull thud that sounded heavier than expected, he noticed that. You traveling with rocks in there? He asked, half joking. She glanced at the suitcase, then back at him. Tools, she said. That answer only deepened his curiosity. They climbed into the wagon, and the cowboy gathered the reins. The horses started forward, pulling them away from the small station and out onto the long dirt road that led toward his ranch. For a while they rode in silence. The prairie stretched wide around them, dry and pale beneath the afternoon sun. A few distant cattle grazed on weak patches of grass. Even from this distance, the cowboy could see how thin they looked. After a mile, she spoke again. Tell me about the wells, she said. They used to run steady, he answered. Clear water. Cold even in summer, then one year the flow slowed. Next year it got worse. Now 2 of them barely give anything. And the soil? Harder every season, grass dies quicker. Crops barely sprout. She nodded as if confirming something already in her mind. The cowboy glanced at her. You look like someone solving a puzzle. I am trying to understand what I will see when we arrive. You talk like you already know. She did not answer right away. The wagon rolled over a stretch of cracked earth, the wheels bumping over dry ruts in the road. A hot wind swept across the land and carried the faint smell of dust. Finally she spoke again. There are ways to bring land back to life, she said quietly. But sometimes the problem is not drought or poor soil? The cowboy frowned. What else could it be? Her eyes moved toward the horizon where his ranch waited somewhere beyond the hills. Sometimes the land is reacting to something buried beneath it. Those words sent a strange feeling through him. He had worked every acre of that ranch for years. Dug wells, plowed fields, fixed fences. Yet the way she said it made him wonder if something had been hiding under his feet the whole time. He tightened his grip on the reins. Guess we will find out soon enough, he said. The woman looked at the road ahead, calm but focused. You might, she replied. Then she rested her hand lightly on the worn leather suitcase beside her. And when we do, you may understand why I truly came here. The wagon creaked steadily as it moved across the long dirt road. The ranch house slowly appeared on the horizon, a small shape surrounded by dry pasture and leaning fences. From a distance it looked tired, like it had been holding its breath for too long. The cowboy watched the land carefully as they approached. Every patch of grass, every empty water trough, every thin cow grazing near the fence reminded him how much the ranch had changed in the past few years. This place had once been strong and full of life. Now it felt like the ground itself was giving up. Beside him, the mail-order bride stayed quiet, her eyes moving across the fields as if she were reading a book written in dirt and dust. When they finally reached the ranch yard, the horses slowed on their own. The wooden gate hung slightly crooked. A windmill turned slowly above the well, its blades squeaking with every rotation. The cowboy climbed down first and tied the reins to a post. The woman stepped down after him, brushing dust from her dress. She did not rush toward the house or ask about unpacking. Instead, she turned in a slow circle, studying the ranch from every angle. "You were not exaggerating," she said calmly. "I wish I had been," the cowboy replied. A thin cow wandered near the fence line, ribs faintly visible beneath its hide. The woman noticed it too. "How many cattle have you lost this year?" she asked. He hesitated. "Too many," that answer seemed to tell her enough. She walked toward the well and looked down into it. The cowboy followed a few steps behind. The windmill groaned again as the blades turned. "Water level dropped fast last summer," he explained. "Now it barely fills a bucket." She crouched and ran her fingers along the dry edge of the stone well wall. Some of the rocks had shifted slightly, leaving narrow cracks between them. "When did the trouble start?" she asked. "About 2 years ago," he thought for a moment, trying to remember exactly when things had begun to change. "First it was the grass, then the wells slowed. Then the cattle started getting weak." The woman stood and dusted her hands. "And before that, anything unusual?" The cowboy shook his head at first, but then something small flickered in his memory. "There was one thing," he said slowly. She turned toward him. "What was it?" "A group of men came through town back then. Said they were surveying land nearby. Looking for something under the ground." Her expression sharpened. "Did they say what they were searching for?" "No, folks around here figured it was just another mining outfit chasing rumors." The woman glanced toward the distant hills beyond the ranch. For the first time since arriving, a shadow of concern crossed her face. "Did they ever come onto your land?" "I told them to stay off it," he said. "But land lines out here are wide. Hard to know where someone might wander." She nodded slowly as if a piece of a puzzle had shifted. "Show me the far pasture," she said. The cowboy raised an eyebrow. "You just got here." "And the ranch is dying," she replied. That was hard to argue with. They saddled 2 horses and rode out across the property. The sun had begun to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked soil. As they rode, the woman kept watching the ground, the plants, even the shape of the hills around them. After nearly an hour, they reached the far pasture. This part of the ranch had suffered the worst. The soil looked pale and lifeless. Even the weeds had stopped growing here. The woman slid down from her horse and knelt in the dirt. She opened the leather suitcase she had carried from the train. Inside were tools the cowboy did not recognize right away. Small metal instruments, glass bottles, folded papers covered with careful notes. She scooped a handful of soil and studied it closely before placing a bit into one of the bottles. The cowboy crossed his arms. "You planning to explain what all this is?" She stood slowly. "I told you I grew up working land," she said. "Most ranchers do not carry around bottles and measuring tools." A faint smile touched her face. "My father taught me more than farming." She looked across the pasture toward a low rise of land near the property edge. "There's something wrong beneath this soil," she said quietly. The cowboy followed her gaze. "What do you think it is?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she closed the suitcase and walked toward the rise in the ground. As the cowboy followed, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The earth near that hill looked disturbed. Not fresh, but not natural either. The woman stopped a few steps from it. Then she said something that made the air feel suddenly heavier. "Someone has been digging here." The cowboy stepped closer to the rise in the ground and studied it with new attention. Now that she had pointed it out, the signs were harder to ignore. The soil looked uneven, packed in strange ways as if it had been dug up and pushed back down again long ago. He crouched and ran his hand across the dirt. "I have ridden past this spot 100 times, he muttered. "Never thought much about it." The mail order bride knelt beside him. She brushed away a thin layer of dust and revealed darker soil beneath. "Because it was meant to look ordinary," she said quietly. The wind rolled across the pasture, carrying the dry smell of the prairie. The horses shifted uneasily a few yards away, stamping their hooves against the hard ground. The cowboy looked toward the distant hills again. "You think those survey men had something to do with this?" "It is possible," she replied. "But whatever they did here, they did not finish the job properly." She opened her suitcase again and pulled out a narrow metal rod with markings along its length. The cowboy watched closely as she pushed it slowly into the soil. The rod slid down deeper than he expected. Her brow tightened slightly. "That should not happen," she murmured. "What does it mean?" She pulled the rod out and examined the dirt stuck to it. "It means something below this ground has been disturbed deeply. Possibly a tunnel, a shaft, or some kind of pocket in the earth." The cowboy felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "You are telling me someone dug under my land?" "Yes." He stood and stared across the pasture again. If that was true, it might explain more than just the strange soil. It might explain the dying grass, the failing wells, even the sickness that had slowly taken hold of his ranch. How could digging cause all that? He asked. The woman wiped the rod clean with a cloth. "Land is like a body," she said. "If something damages the structure beneath the surface, everything above it begins to suffer. Water stops flowing the way it should. Soil loses its strength." She walked slowly around the disturbed area, studying the ground carefully. The cowboy followed her steps. As they moved along the edge of the rise, he noticed something half buried near a clump of brittle weeds. A piece of wood. He bent down and pulled it free. It was part of an old crate, weathered but still holding faint markings burned into the side. The letters were worn, but a few were still visible. The cowboy brushed away the dirt. "What does that say?" The woman leaned closer. Her expression changed the moment she read it. "Mining supply company," she said. The cowboy felt his jaw tighten. So they were not just surveying. No, she looked back at the hill again. If they dug here and abandoned the work, they might have left an unstable pocket underground. Over time, the soil above it would weaken. Water could drain away. The land would slowly collapse inward. The cowboy looked around the pasture, suddenly seeing the damage differently. The thin grass, the cracked earth, the wells drying up. All of it might have started right here. "So, if that is the problem," he said carefully, "can it be fixed?" She hesitated for the first time since arriving. "It can be repaired if the damage is not too deep, and if it is?" She did not answer immediately. The windmill from the ranch creaked faintly in the distance. Finally she spoke. "Then the entire water flow beneath your ranch may continue to fail." The cowboy felt the weight of that truth settle over him. 2 years of struggle suddenly had a possible cause, but the solution sounded just as uncertain. He kicked lightly at the dirt near the rise. The soil shifted more easily than it should have. That was when he heard it. A dull hollow sound beneath his boot. He froze. The woman heard it too. Slowly, she stepped closer and tapped the ground with the metal rod. Again the same hollow echo came from below. They looked at each other. "There is space under there," the cowboy said. "Yes," she answered. He swallowed. "How big do you think it is?" Her eyes moved across the slope, measuring the ground, the cracks, the strange patterns in the soil. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but serious. "Big enough that if it collapses suddenly, this entire pasture could sink." The cowboy stared at the land that had been his life for years. "And the ranch house sits right along the same water line." She nodded slowly. "Which meant if they did nothing, the damage might soon spread far beyond this hill." The sun had dropped low now, painting the prairie in deep gold and shadow. The cowboy looked at her. "You said you did not come here only to be a bride." She closed the suitcase and held it firmly. "I came because I know how to stabilize land like this." His hope rose slightly. "But," she added quietly, looking at the unstable hill again, "we will have to start tonight." He frowned. "Why tonight?" She pointed to a thin crack forming near the center of the rise. The ground shifted slightly as a small line of dirt slid downward. Then she said the words that made his chest tighten. "Because the collapse may have already started." The thin crack in the ground widened slightly as loose dirt slid down the slope. It was not a dramatic collapse, but it was enough to prove the woman was right. Something beneath the pasture had been hollowed out, and the land above it was slowly giving way. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This ranch had been his life, the place he had fought to keep alive, even when the drought and failing wells made it seem hopeless. Now the truth stood right in front of him. The dying ranch was not just bad luck. The land itself had been weakened from below. He looked at the mail-order bride. "You said you know how to stabilize land like this," he said. "Tell me what we have to do." She opened the suitcase and pulled out several tools along with a folded map covered in careful notes. She spread the paper across the flat top of the crate they had found earlier. "My father worked with ranchers and farmers who faced problems like this," she explained. "Collapsed wells, damaged soil, underground cavities. He taught me how to read the land and repair the flow beneath it." The cowboy listened closely. "The first step is relieving the pressure," she continued. "If the hollow space keeps spreading, the collapse will grow worse. But if we reinforce the weak ground and guide the water back through the right channels, the land can recover." The cowboy glanced again at the crack forming in the hill. "And we can do that tonight. We can start tonight." They rode back to the ranch house quickly and gathered what tools they could. Lanterns, shovels, wooden beams from an old shed, anything strong enough to support unstable ground. The sun disappeared behind the prairie hills as they returned to the pasture. The night air cooled the dry land, and the lantern light flickered across the cracked soil. Working side by side, they began digging small controlled trenches around the weakened area. The woman directed each step carefully, placing wooden supports where the ground felt soft and guiding the cowboy where to dig and where to leave the soil untouched. Hours passed. The cowboy could feel the exhaustion in his arms, but he kept going. Something about her calm determination pushed him forward. She worked with quiet focus, checking the soil, listening for hollow sounds beneath the earth, adjusting their work when the ground shifted. At one point they uncovered a narrow opening that led into the abandoned tunnel left by the mining crew years before. It was not large, but it was enough to weaken the water flow beneath the ranch. The woman studied it carefully. "This is the source of the problem," she said. "The tunnel redirected the underground water away from your wells." They packed the opening with layers of stone and reinforced it with the beams they had carried out. Slowly, the unstable soil began to settle as the pressure beneath the hill was reduced. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the prairie, the pasture looked different. The dangerous crack had stopped spreading. The ground felt firmer beneath their boots. The cowboy wiped the dirt from his hands and looked across the ranch. A soft breeze moved through the grass, and for the first time in a long while the land did not seem as lifeless as before. They returned to the main well near the windmill. The woman leaned over the edge and lowered the bucket. For a moment there was only silence. Then the bucket touched water. Clear, steady water. She pulled it up slowly and handed it to the cowboy. He stared at it, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. The water level had already begun to rise. "The underground flow is returning," she said with a tired smile. "It will take time, but your ranch will recover." The cowboy looked across the fields where the morning sun now stretched across the land. The cattle moved slowly near the fence line, and the windmill turned steadily above the well. He let out a long breath he felt like he had been holding for years. "You did not just save my ranch," he said quietly. "You saved everything I built here." She rested her hand on the edge of the well. "I told you I did not come here only to be a bride." He nodded with a small smile. "Seems I ended up with both." The prairie stretched wide around them, but now it felt different. The ranch no longer stood on the edge of failure. It stood on the beginning of a new chapter. And as the sun rose over the land, the cowboy realized that the letter he had sent months ago had brought more than help to his dying ranch. It had brought hope back to the prairie.